And good evening, everybody. Chris Hunt here with Hatch Travel, Hatch Magazine, and a gang of three School of Trout professors, if you will. We are live on social media this evening to answer questions from you about fly
Chris, hold
fishing.
on. Chris, we're not live yet. Hold on. I'll say it in the chat.
All right.
Sounded good though, Chris.
Well, I'm gonna redo it all now. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Chris Hunt here with Hatch Adventure Travel and Hatch Magazine. I'm joined tonight with by our School of Trout professors. We are talking tonight about fly fishing and how to be a well-rounded angler. As you all know, the School of Trout is a series of classes that's offered by the School of Trout. I don't know what we're going to call you, Todd. The Grand Poobah.
Yeah, that works, Chris.
Yeah.
I run the show,
So anyway, Todd runs two classes, two this summer coming up, one in August, and then the one we're talking about tonight at the end of September, called the Tao of Trout, and that is the focus of this evening's discussion on how to be a well-rounded fly fisher. And we're joined, of course, by Todd Tanner, who is the director of the School of Trout, if you will. John Juracek, who is a renowned fly caster and fly casting instructor, who is based out of beautiful West Yellowstone, Montana, and then Pat McCabe, an excellent guide and one of the returning professors for just about every School of Trout class that we've had so far. It is kind of an all-star lineup tonight. We hope that you've come ready with questions, because that's what these guys are going to do. We're going to answer questions, and we're going to start off, rather than do intros, when I send you guys a question, if it's the first question, just give us a quick, 10, 15 seconds on who you are, where you are, what you do, what you love, etc., and then take the question. And we're going to start off with a question from Doug Hachimanji. And the question goes as reads, and Todd, we're going to start with you. Here's the question. Let's say you're heading out on the river and you anticipate dry fly or dry dropper fishing with a variety of possible fly sizes. What leader size do you start with? And how do you adjust your leader as you transition through different fly sizes? Todd?
That's a great question, Doug. Thank you. And for those folks who don't know me, my name is Todd Tanner, and I'm a longtime outdoor writer, and I used to be a fly fishing guide, and now I do run the School of Trout with some truly stellar anglers like John and Pat and Tom Rosenbauer and Kirk Dieter, a bunch of folks, Hillary Hutchison. So to Doug's question, what I would tend to do is I would start out with sort of maybe a 10-foot 4X or a 10-foot 3X leader. And then I would build that leader out or down based on what I thought I was going to start out with. One of the things that folks need to know as they adjust leader length and leader size is that we have to take into account the fly or the flies that we're going to use going forward. And we also have to take into account the presentations that we expect. So if I'm fishing dry fly, that's a little different than fishing a dry and a dropper. What I would say is that I believe Doug asked about fishing spring creeks in mid-April. Am I right about that, Chris?
No, he just said where do you start? What leader what size do you start with, and then how do you adjust your leader as you transition through different fly sizes?
Okay, sure.
You might want to add to that is on the dropper. maybe also consider the the material of your leader. If you want to go on the dropper and drop a fluorocarbon under a nylon, etc. Give that some
Right.
thought.
Well, so the first thing to get right is to adjust the leader size, the length, and the tip.
Oh, we lost Todd.
That you're focused on. If I'm fishing,
sorry, you're good. Go ahead. You froze up for a
okay.
second.
If we're fishing a dry fly and we just adjust the tippet length and diameter to the size of that dry fly. If I'm fishing a size 16 dry fly, I'm probably going to go with a 5X tippet. Those two sizes tend to go well together. If I was fishing a size 10, I might drop down to a 4X tippet. If I was fishing an 18 or a 20, I'm probably going to bounce down to a 6X or even a 7X if the currents are fussy. The thing that I would suggest people do is that they start out with the prepackaged store-bought leader and then adjust either the butt section or the tippet section. I usually spend more time on the tippet section. Most of the prepackaged leaders come with a relatively short tippet section, so maybe 2 feet. I might go back 18 inches, cut that off, and knot on another 2.5 feet or 3 feet of tippet to that. And one of the things that's a little tricky these days is that a lot of the prepackaged leaders come with a relatively short transition zone. So we have to be really careful if we're trying to mess around with the midsection of that leader. It's easier to focus on either the thicker end or the thinner end. As far as dropping a dropper off of a dry fly, for example, first off, we have to decide how we're going to tie that on. And the focus there for me would be, I would rather tie on to the bend of the dry fly hook as opposed to try and put 2 pieces of tippet through the eye. That's typically easier. And I think it also gives a little bit better drift. And I would go with either the same size tippet in terms of, say, we're using 5X. I would either stick with 5X from the dry to the dropper, or I might, if I'm using a really small dropper, I might drop down a size. So it's a pretty complicated subject. It's a crazy thing to start off with, but it's one of those things where we're looking to try to create the very best possible drift that we can get. And that takes into account the water type, what the wind's doing, how long our leader is, how far away we're fishing. All those things come into account. I have a question, John. What did I miss?
I think that's a pretty good answer. Here's just to give people sort of a stock answer, something they can just grasp and go with. Here's what I might try. I would start with a 9-foot 3X leader. I'm going to cut off 2 feet of that from the tippet end. So I'll probably have just a little bit of tippet left there. So I'm at 7 feet now. I'm going to add a foot of 4X to that. And then I'm going to add about 10 inches of 5X to that. And then I'm going to put my tippet of 6X, say 3 feet of 6X. So I'm roughly going to end up about 12 feet long to a 6X tippet. If I want to fish a slightly larger fly, then I will simply take that tippet off or not put it on and lengthen out the 5X section or lengthen out the 4X section. And I think that's just a sort of a simple way to go about modifying, the typical store-bought leader.
Pat, any thoughts on that?
Todd and John pretty much covered that. I think between their two answers is about what I do. I think what John just described is a pretty typical starting point for me for most of my fishing. Thinking about typical dry fly fishing. The only thing I was thinking when Todd started is the question doesn't specify the water type. And so if I'm on a very small stream, then I might not start with that long leader. I might start with a 7.5-foot leader. But otherwise, you can either lengthen the leader with the butt section. I know Tom Rosenbauer is a big proponent of that. But I have to admit my tendency is to work on the tippet end as well and cut off. I usually cut off about 18 inches of the store-bought tippet and then build it back out to the leader that I'm trying to achieve, depending on the conditions. So,
Okay. A couple of kind of related questions. This next one is especially related. We talked about it a little bit, Todd. This is from Dan Doubtful, and the question is, how do you guys feel about fluorocarbon versus nylon? And let's start with Pat on this one.
okay. Fluorocarbon versus nylon. Well, I would say that, if I'm dry fly fishing in particular, I pretty much fish nylon. I don't fish fluorocarbon at all. I guess the two most basic things with that are one, fluorocarbon is denser and tends to sink. And I don't think I need any of the qualities of it as far as abrasion resistance or, light reflection or, refraction. Nymphing, there are times that I'll tie on a short section of tippet with fluorocarbon right at the fly, but I don't fish typically a whole fluorocarbon leader or a lot of it, mostly because it doesn't break down in the natural world. It sticks around forever, and so I try to minimize how much of it I use. And if I can fish with nylon, at least it'll break down. It may take a long time, but for the most part, I don't fish a lot of fluorocarbon.
Okay. Todd or John, any thoughts on that question?
I'm right there with Pat in the sense that I don't use it at all. And part of the main reason I don't use it is because it does not break down. And I just don't think that there's, we espouse ourselves to be conservationists, and I just don't think there's any room for us to be using something like that out there that is going to stick around forever. But I don't judge any people for using it, but it's just not right for me. And so
what's your alternative? I mean, one of the reasons people use fluorocarbon is that it's a sinker. It goes down fast. How do you make nylon behave like fluorocarbon if you have the the desire to do so?
Well, I think we're talking about degrees in terms of sinking. It's not as if fluorocarbon's going down like a sinking line. You're talking about minor differences, and I think you could adjust that. If you're going to use monofilament, you can either use a slightly heavier fly. You could put some sort of weight on your leader, that sort of thing, and really kind of override what I think the perceived advantages are of the sinking.
Okay. Do you prefer a weighted fly, or do you prefer to add, some non-toxic, like a tungsten pinch-on sinker? What's your
I always use a weighted fly. Yeah, I don't like putting any kind of weight on my leader.
Good answer. Todd, thoughts?
Chris, I would agree with what John and Pat both said. I don't necessarily want to be part of the course, but I don't use, about the only time I use fluoro is if I'm steelhead fishing and I use stuff that's so heavy it's not likely to break off, because I do not want to leave that in the bottom of the river. We shouldn't be putting garbage in the river that's going to be there 2,000 years or 5,000 years from now. There's just no reason to do that. So
yeah, we could probably do an entire webcast on forever chemicals and how they end up staying and sticking around for forever. Related question also from Dan. I'm going to get to some different questions first, but these are kind of all in the same wheelhouse. For trout fishing, do you prefer a double taper or a weight forward fly line? I'll start with you, Todd.
Chris, I use both of them, and I think probably everything else being equal, I prefer a double taper because there's more weight in the belly. The only weight on a weight forward, the vast majority of the weight forward is on the very front end. I tend to fish in relatively tight, especially, when I'm trout fishing. I'm going to be anywhere from 15 to 35 feet out. And I want my rods to load at that distance. If I'm using a weight forward, I'm making load correctly. With a double taper, that's less of an issue. So, and then, sort of the standard double taper response from back in the day was that, well, when you wear out one end, you can cut it off, turn it around, and fish the other end, which still holds true today. For those of us who don't have a bunch of.
Yep. Totally got it. Hey, John,
sort of makes sense to get the most that we can out of line.
Okay. John, you being a casting instructor, that's a question that I'd love to hear your answer to.
Well, I'm old school and I mostly use double tapers. And I know that's, they've really faded in popularity over the years. But these days, what I don't like about weight forwards is not so much that, they're substantially different in terms of the length of the belly versus a double taper, but the taper towards the tip and the tips themselves are very, very short, often a very short line tip and a very severe taper down to that tip. And so I don't really like that transition. I want something that's a little more drawn out, which I think it helps make my casting a little smoother, my presentation. So I stick with double tapers to the extent that I possibly can.
Okay. While we're talking about casting, Jason Miller has a question for you, John, and I'd like to hear the others chime in as well. Can you explain a reach cast?
Sure. So a reach cast is a kind of cast we make to basically fight drag. So if we're casting to a fish or a target and there is fast water between us and that target, most of the time we want to reposition our line upstream so that when those fast currents act on that line, our fly gets a natural drift before all that slack in that line gets swept downstream and drags our fly. So we're basically 99% of the time in a reach cast, we're repositioning our line upstream of our fly. Very rarely would we do it downstream. So upstream of the fly. How do we do that? We make our normal casting stroke. And as we stop the rod on the forward stroke, we literally reach with our hand and rod, say roughly at a 45-degree angle from our target. Okay? And so there's not a big delay here. As soon as you stop that rod, you want to make the reach motion. Okay? And again, we're going to reach with our rod and our arm, and we're going to point basically 45 degrees upstream of our target. That's just kind of a stock reach cast. And I think that if you want to see this in action, there are a couple of videos that you can look at on the School of Trout website, and you will see that left reach casts and right reach casts are being made in those. And I know it's hard to describe that cast, but that's kind of what I've got for you. I hope it helps.
It's one of those things that's a lot easier to show than explain, I think.
Indeed.
It certainly is for me anyway, especially if let's say I'm facing the river. River is flowing from my left to right. Having to reach as a right-handed caster, having to reach across is a little more challenging. But being able to watch you do that would be helpful. I might ask Chad if you wouldn't mind, just in a moment, to put up the School of Trout URL for that video. I realize that takes us kind of away from this, but it might be something that folks can reference later on. I'm assuming Todd and Pat that John's answer is pretty solid. You're not going to critique it. You're not going to give him any BS on the side. You're good.
I'm going to give John a hard time, Chris, because there's one thing. There's one distinction I would make with the reach cast. One of the things I've seen over the years with an awful lot of folks is that they try and do two movements. So they cast forward and then they reach one way or the other way. Okay. And I think it's important to understand that when we come to a stop, we swing very smoothly rather which will end up with a reach cast that's less than optimum, that's sort of clunky and doesn't work as well. So I would say if we can swing easily to one side or the other. I hate to disagree with John on anything when it comes to casting, but I have found over the years that people do tend to focus on forward cast, then reach, and it's better if that's all one movement.
Okay.
Pat, what do you think?
Good. Pat, any thoughts that Todd or John missed? I mean, neither of these guys is perfect as far as we know.
As far as the reach casting is concerned, the only two things I wouldn't disagree with what Todd said, but I do think that when I do it, there is a positive stop toward my target and then a reach. Although I don't know that you would perceive it watching me cast easily, and I would guess that the same thing is true with Todd's cast. That it's there is a positive stop toward the target before the reach commences. The only other thing was, John talked about repositioning the line to create slack upstream. And I think the other useful thing with a reach cast is being able to position the line in a similar or the same current line that the fish is in, which also reduces opportunity for drag.
So just in general, the average angler probably has learned before he learns or she learns the reach cast, they've learned to mend the line. Maybe explain just a little bit about how the reach cast might be a good substitute for a mend in an average cast that requires an adjustment for drag.
Well, the reach cast, I mean, it essentially becomes a mend. Ahead of time, right? So you make the mend as you present the fly, and so you've bought yourself some time. I think that's the biggest thing, where a reach cast can either completely replace a mend. If you're casting accurately to a specific rising fish, if you place your fly, say 2 feet upstream of where that fish is rising, and make a good reach, you may not need to mend before your fly gets to the fish at all. Otherwise, if you're making a longer drift, you're covering water, the reach cast is going to buy you some time. It's going to buy you some drift, and some slack, which allows you time to better make mends without adjusting or moving the fly on the surface of the, once you've presented it.
Excellent answer. While I got you here, what's best for trout fishing, a fast action or a slow action fly rod?
Boy, that's a loaded question right there. None of the manufacturers are on here, are they? I think to some extent there's some personal preference involved there. I know a lot of great anglers that fish very fast rods. Certainly for myself, when I was very young, I started gravitating toward faster rods as I was becoming, as I was growing as an angler. I started, my first rod was a very slow fiberglass rod, and then, as graphite was getting more and more, the higher modulus graphites were developing, I gravitated toward the faster rods. And then at a certain point, especially as I was fishing a lot of spring creeks and fine tippets, and I started gravitating back towards a more moderate action rod. And so most of my fishing has been done with a pretty moderate action rod. Some of the old Winstons and that kind of old Scots have been rods that I really enjoy fishing. And now I find as I get older, maybe I'm just slowing down, but so are my rods. I'm finding I'm enjoying the slower and slower rods for most things. I do think that in certain situations, high wind, saltwater angling, things like that, then I might tend to gravitate back toward a little bit faster rod. Steelhead fishing, I'm throwing long casts. My rods are certainly powerful. I don't know that I would call them necessarily fast, I certainly don't tend to lean toward the fastest rods at all. But that's, maybe it's just personal preference. So for me, it's a more moderate or slower action rod.
I'm sure that plays into it, but I'm definitely in agreement. The more I fish, for trout especially, the more I gravitate to slower, more leisurely casting rods. John, I'd love to hear your answer to that question as well.
Well, I sort of agree with Pat. I think it's impossible to say that one type of action is best for trout fishing, because trout fishing encompasses so many different things. There are so many variables and different methods of fishing and different distances and weights of flies and things like that, that I would never say, I don't think we can specifically say something is best, but I think if we're trying to narrow it down to where someone has just a rod choice and they have to make it, and they want something that really works all around, I would choose a moderate action rod. Neither really stiff nor really slow, but moderate action. And I think for most general trout fishing scenarios, that's probably going to be your best answer overall. So and again, there's so many variables there to consider, but I would just go for something moderate.
So explain what that means for the average angler who steps into a fly shop to buy a trout rod, and they have just heard you say, I want a moderate action fly rod. When you go to a fly shop, how do you identify that?
Well,
We all do the wiggle, we all do the stuff that we do when we go to a fly shop. But how do you determine where the bend is, what the speed of a rod is, and how it's going to cast before you even put a reel on it?
yeah, we can get a very good idea of the action of a rod by simply grabbing the grip and wiggling it. How much of the rod is bending, where is it bending, and to what degree is it bending? And if you shake enough of those, anybody is going to be able to recognize very quickly that some rods bend more than others. And these days, there are not very many slow rods being produced, so that's going to be kind of hard to find. But the vast majority of rods these days tend towards the stiffer side. But there is a little bit of movement back towards more moderate action rods. And so basically, you just got to go in and shake them. That'll give you a really good idea right off the bat. And then, of course, it's always best to cast them after that.
Okay. Todd, you're kind of I don't want to say kind of, you are a dry fly purist as far as I know, as much as anybody I know. What's your preferred rod speed?
I would say, Chris, that I'm gonna agree with both John and Pat. I have a lot of rods, and I have fished a lot of rods over the years. I tend to fish more moderate action rods, sort of not real slow, not real fast. The one thing I'll add to what John and Pat said is that there's a visceral pleasure to casting a moderate action rod that you don't get with a fast action rod. It's the act of casting itself is truly enjoyable. You can feel the rod load, you feel it unload. Your timing is typically better because not only are you seeing something happen with your fly line, but you're feeling it happen as well. So you can combine those two things and your timing improves. So I would just say that, to my mind, I'm typically less focused on what rod is going to do the absolute best job for what I'm working on, what situation I'm in right now. And I'm more focused on what's going to bring me the most enjoyment. What am I going to have the most fun with? What's going to put the biggest smile on my face out there? And typically that's a moderate action rod. To be really frank, fast action rods make me work way, way harder on the water than I want to work. And I just like the idea of relaxing a little bit more, being more in tune with everything around me, and having a rod that sort of adds to my overall experience, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Let's talk about flies for just a minute. Got a couple questions that are fly related. What are your favorite fly patterns for trout? This comes from Earl Harper, who's a good friend of mine and one of my business partners with Hatch Adventure Travel. So favorite fly patterns for trout. We'll start with you, Todd.
Ooh, favorite fly patterns for trout. John actually has developed a couple of them with Craig Matthews. The X-Caddis is one of my favorite patterns. And the Sparkle Dun for mayflies is a wonderful pattern. One of the crazy things that we didn't, the last time we did one of these things, we had Tom Rosenbauer on, and we didn't ask Tom what dry fly he has tattooed on his arm, but it's one of John's Sparkle Duns, John and Craig Sparkle Duns. And I think that's pretty wild. I mean, that's a pattern I've been fishing back. God, I don't even want to say how far back I've been fishing that. And I've had a tremendous amount of success with it. So the X-Caddis and the Sparkle Dun would be the two that sort of come to mind immediately for me.
I guess that means I'm up. Chris, I can't hear you.
Sorry, Pat. What's your go-to dry fly patterns?
My favorite dry fly patterns, not just trout fishing.
Let's go with dry for now.
I was kind of thinking about that as Todd was talking, and I was thinking kind of it tends to be more of a style of fly. So, I mean, the sparkle dun certainly comes into play. I like to fish a lot of emergers or cripple style patterns. If I had to narrow it down, I certainly sparkle dun is right up there in my box as well. Renee Harrop's Last Chance Cripple is one of my very favorite mayfly emerging patterns. And then as far as caddis's are concerned, just a very simple, CDC caddis works great for me.
We might have lost you. Let's see. It's going to reload here. Yeah, you're back. You're with us.
I'm back. What did you not hear?
You finished off with Renee Harrop's Cripple done, and then you were going to give the secret to all fly fishing wisdom, and it went dark.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say for a caddis pattern, I just like a very simple CDC caddis, just a dubbed body with a down CDC wing. And the one fly, people tend to relate to me and I've always fished it as a very small humpy has always been just a go-to searching pattern for me, or if a fish is particularly picky on everything else, or there's really heavy hatches, it's a fly that I've had great success with over the years, and probably more because I have confidence in it than any other reason.
When you say very small, what are you talking?
20s, 22s.
Okay, it's pretty small humpy.
Yeah, if I could find somebody else to tie them.
Exactly. Sean, how about you?
Well, I have two flies that I use a lot. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're favorites, although I guess you could say they are favorites. But I like flies that simply work, that do the job that they're intended to do. That we're talking dry flies, that they float well, that I can see them, that they're durable, and that they work. And so the two I probably go to more than any others are a sparkle dun, which like Pat and Todd, I tie in a variety of sizes and colors to match all sorts of different mayflies. And in terms of caddis flies, I prefer an iris caddis, which is an emerging caddis pattern. Again, I tie it in various colors and sizes. And I would say those two, iris caddis and sparkle dun.
Okay, so let's stick with flies for a second here. Rick Jorgensen wants to know what your favorite midge pattern is. And do you use midge patterns that dead drift, or do you prefer midge patterns that kind of skitter, like like a natural on the water?
Well, I tie a lot of midges, but they aren't stock conventional patterns. So things I use are all modifications of existing patterns, I would say. If you had to pick one overall, just to sort of say, hey, this works lots of the time, I'd pick a Griffiths gnat, probably, because it can work as a clump of adults, it can work as a single emerging midge, it can kind of work as a fluttering, skittering midge. So I'd pick a Griffiths gnat over anything, but by and large, when I fish midge patterns, I'm always fishing them dead drift. I don't really skitter them.
Excellent. All right, a couple more questions here. Let's see here. We were talking a little bit ago about rod action. In light of your comments on rod action, this is from Josh Friedman. Do any of you fish glass or bamboo when it comes to trout? You want to start with you, John?
Sure. I do fish bamboo. I've got 4 or 5 different rods in bamboo, and I like them all. They tend to be a little bit on the slower side. So yes, I use them. I do have a fiberglass rod. It's my original fly rod. It's a 7.5 foot 6 weight Eagle Claw from about 1972. Actually, yeah, probably right in there, 72. And so I have that. I don't use it very often these days, but I do have both fiberglass and bamboo. And more than the material itself, I tend to focus on the action of the rod. That's really what I'm after, action and length that suits whatever I need it to do on that given day.
Very nice. I've got my granddad's old bamboo rod that I actually had redone about 2-3 years ago, and I've actually been fishing it, and I love it. In fact, I would pick it. It's a good small stream. Says it's a 5 weight, but I put a 4 weight line on it, and it's just amazing. I love how you really are tuned into the cast more than you are anything else. Todd, thoughts on glass or bamboo?
Sure, Chris. I don't fish glass, and it's not because I don't like it. I actually I find the most glass rods to be very pleasant to cast, but I don't tend to fish shorter rods very much. Most of the water I fish tends to be big and open. I'm not spending a lot of time on brushy little creeks. And so a 7 foot or a 7.5 foot or even an 8 foot rod is a little bit short for me. When I do fish a shorter, slower rod, I have one cane rod that I fish that I really, really enjoy. And I mean, the thing about cane that's sort of neat is it's got soul, right? You're fishing something that used to be alive, and there's a different sensation to it. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, but I really, really do enjoy it. And sort of an interesting sidebar, I tend to really like graphite rods that remind me of good cane rods. They're a little bit longer. Most of the graphite I fish is 9 foot, 8.5 would be pretty short for me. Occasionally 9.5 or 10 for some of the bigger weights. But I like that cane action. And so when I can replicate that, I've been fishing a Montana Brothers 9 foot 4 weight a lot recently. And John is one of the people who has added input into the design of the Montana Brothers rods. And to me, that's one of the few graphite rods that really has soul, that it just sings in my hand and comes alive. That's sort of what I'm looking for, but people can find that in glass and in cane probably easier than most of the graphite rods out there.
Thanks, Todd. Pat, thoughts on glass or grass, as they say?
Well, I do own one bamboo fly rod that I enjoy fishing, and I, kicking myself for years now for selling one that I wish I had not gotten rid of. I don't currently own any fiberglass rods, although just last weekend I was out actually casting a whole bunch of old Fenwick glass rods, and so lately I have actually been kind of keeping my eyes open for a few models that are 70s vintage Fenwicks that I would like to purchase. Actually, they're enjoyable to cast, and I think that they also they tend to really give me a lot of feedback on my own casting. Help me hone in on things, any mistakes I'm making and what have you.
That's a good point. When you're forced to slow your cast down, the quirks and the bad habits tend to become more enunciated. Quick question while we're on this topic. My buddy Drew Youngdyke has a question. I'm thinking about fishing my grandpa's old bamboo rod. Of course, it's unmarked. How do I go about determining its line weight without actually breaking it? And I'll start with you, Pat.
Certainly by feel, it would be the first thing for, if you know somebody that has any bamboo experience, you might start there. Otherwise, if it's an old bamboo rod from way back when it was grandfather's rod, chances are it's not a 4-weight. Chances are it's a 5 or a 6 weight or maybe even a 7 weight. But so I might start with a 5-weight line and see what it how that it reacts to that. But if Grandpa was a trout fisherman, my gut would be it's probably a 6-weight ish rod. I'd be curious what John's thoughts are on that as well. I think he may have some input there.
John, let's answer on that. This is the old bamboo rods, especially the old ones, 1930s and earlier.
Yeah.
They a lot of them didn't come with an operator's manual. So maybe some thoughts on how to find the right weight of an older bamboo rod.
Well, as Pat said, and I think he's right here, the odds are that it is a heavier line weight or heavier we would consider today. So I would start with a 6 weight on it and just take that out and cast it. Don't worry about breaking it. Bamboo is a very durable material. People often think of it as very fragile, but it's not. It's durable. So take it out and cast it with a 6 and see how you like it. There's a good chance it could be a 7 weight too, a very uncommon line size these days, but one that was very common back in the day. Try it with a 7, try it with a 5, see what you think. There's no right or wrong here, and you'll have a different sensation with each of those line weights on it. And most rods are capable of casting many different line sizes. They simply feel differently with the different line weights. So start with a 6, see what you think about that. Try a 7, try a 5, and settle on the one that you think feels best for you.
Excellent. This question is from Liz Rutt. I'm blessed to live in East Tennessee with 2 amazing tailwaters, South Holston and the Watauga. I used to fish delayed harvest water in North Carolina. Do you feel as though it is considered a bit cheating fishing those stocker fish compared to wild browns on the Soho? They're much more challenging to catch, or so it seems. This is that well-rounded angler question. Not all of us live within reach of the Henry's Fork. Some of us are fishing tailwaters, and some of us are fishing waters that are heavily stocked. So it's a good question to address. We'll start with you, John, but I'd really love answers on this from the panel in general.
Well, I don't think there's any cheating involved in fishing for stocked fish. I mean, I think if that's what you have as an option, then that's what you fish. I certainly would. I grew up fishing in eastern Iowa, and almost every trout stream we had there was reliant upon stocked fish. And so I spent years and years fishing over stocked fish because that's what my options were. That's what I had available. And so I would never consider that cheating. Is it different than fishing for wild trout? Of course it is. But it is not without its rewards. And so I would say feel free to go ahead and do it, and don't feel anything funny about it whatsoever.
Thanks, John. Todd, thoughts on that? I mean, you live in northwest Montana. You're surrounded by wild trout water. You used to guide on the Henry's Fork. I mean, you're sort of in the breadbasket of American fly fishing, and the idea of going after stocked fish may not seem terribly appealing, but keep in mind that we don't all live in places like northwest Montana.
No, you're right, Chris. And Liz, what I would say is that John's absolutely right. You fish what you have to fish. I grew up in upstate New York, and I had the opportunity to fish rivers like the Beaverkill in the Delaware. And while there were a few fish around that were wild, most of those fish were stocked. Most of the fish that I fished in Connecticut on the Farmington or the Housatonic were stocked fish. It's not cheating. It's not a bad thing. I mean, I think what we have to understand is that if people on the East Coast weren't stocking fish, there would be very, very few trout left. The waters are not as pristine as they used to be. There are fewer trees to provide shade along a lot of rivers. Warmer water is an issue pretty much everywhere these days. And stocking allows us to have fish in places that we wouldn't otherwise be able to fish for trout. So, and not that trout are the only thing out there, obviously, in places like North Carolina or Tennessee or South Carolina, I would assume that there's some really good smallmouth fishing. But if you're going to fish for trout and you want to fish for trout and the option is stocked trout, I say go for it.
All right, we're going to go back to fly lines for a second. And Pat, we're going to start with you on this one. This is from JC Combs. And the question, here's the question verbatim. This is a lame question. There are no lame questions. I've heard too many answers. How often should fly line be replaced? I'm sure, use is a great factor, but I'd love to know the answer from someone who's not trying to sell me fly line. There you go.
Okay. Well, again, hopefully the manufacturers aren't listening, but I mean, I don't replace a fly line unless it's damaged, to a point that it's, and if my fly line gets cracks in it, then I'll replace my fly line. But if it's in good shape and I clean it regularly, some of my lines are, honestly, some of my lines are probably 20 years old. Because, if they're on if it's a line that I'm not fishing a lot, there's nothing wrong with it. They don't seem to wear out on the reel if I'm not fishing them. So, take care of your lines. If you clean your lines and don't cast them on the asphalt, I mean, a fly line will last a long time. If they start cracking or sinking or not behaving well, then replace the fly line. So that's my answer. What's that?
What's your fly line cleaning regimen look like? How do you maintain? If you've got lines that are 20 years old, I'm guessing that they've been through all of the cleaning materials and the microfibers and all that jazz. What's your
Sure. I mean, usually it's I just use a terry cloth rag, and John actually pointed out this 303 cleaner you can pick up just about anywhere. John can tell you exactly. Is it Dow, John, or?
It's 303 aerospace protectant.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I'm not sure who makes it off the top of my head.
Yeah,
So-
I could run and grab it. It's over on the other side of the room here. I can go grab it and look at it more carefully. But a bottle of that will last you for years and years and years and years. And, I just clean my lines with that. Seems to work great. I have used all the line cleaners that were out there, previously that I could buy at a fly shop. But since I don't have a fly shop anywhere readily available to me, that stuff works great.
John, I wanted to ask this next question aimed at you. This is from Yamaha Rider. I don't think that's his or her real name, but we're going to assume that they have a Yamaha bike. What's a good line taper for fiberglass rods, and would it depend on the length of the rod and the manufacturer?
I think it may depend on the length of the rod, because that's going to speak to the kind of fishing you're doing and how far you're casting. So these days, without knowing the specifics of his fishing, type of fishing and distance he's casting, I think you could go either way. You could go with a conventional weight forward, though I wish they had slightly longer tips and slightly longer front tapers, but it's not the end of the world to go with that. If you can find a double taper, that'd be a fine choice too. Either way, we're kind of splitting hairs here a little bit. And when I said earlier, I prefer double tapers, that's after, a lifetime of fly fishing. And I have a really sort of, specific approach to the sport that I take that is not as general as most people are fishing. So either way, weight forward or double taper, get one or the other. You're not really gonna have to worry about it. They're both gonna be fine. And hey, one last question or one comment on the line cleaner thing.
Yeah.
So I use a 303 aerospace protectant as well. And then the other thing I will occasionally do is use some of the Scientific Anglers fly line dressing after that. It's got a lot of plasticizers in it, and it really will slicken that line out a lot. So sometimes I'll use a combination of the 303 and the SA line dressing.
Good tip. Good tip. Everybody got that? Good.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
A couple of good questions here, and Todd, we're going to start with you on this one. Knowing what you know today, and which is a whole hell of a lot. What tactical advice would you give, and what philosophical advice would you give to yourself way back when you first put a fly rod in your hands? What would you tell your 40-year-old or 40-year-ago self, 50-year-ago self, whatever it was? What advice would you give yourself, knowing what you know today about fly fishing?
I think, Chris, I wouldn't actually give myself an awful lot of advice, but maybe one thing I would do is I would tell myself not to worry as much about how other people perceive me on the water. When I started fly fishing, I fished a lot on a couple of rivers that were relatively close to where I was living at the time in New York. The 10 Mile, I fished the East Branch of the Croton, and I fished the Housatonic in Connecticut. And I used to, when I'd go fish the Housatonic, it had some wonderful water. There was a fly fishing only section there that was just great. And I would go other places because the fly fishing water was always relatively crowded. And I was afraid that I would offend people by casting so poorly and fishing so poorly that I would like, the people who had been doing it for a while would look at me and just be like sort of aghast that, wow, who is this guy and what is he doing here? And he's literally offensive. He's hurting my eyes with his casting and his lame attempts to mend and, all these crazy things that he's doing. And I should not have worried so much about that. There's only one reason to fly fish when it comes right down to it. We're not feeding ourselves or our families. It's not like we need to go out and catch that trout and bonk him on the head and take him home and eat him for our survival. We do it because we enjoy it, because we love it, because it gives us an excuse to spend time outdoors in nature. I love standing in water. And I think what I would tell myself probably is just don't worry what other people think. Figure out the things that you enjoy the most and do them once you've gotten good enough that you can do everything. Once you've gotten to the point where, you can fish dry flies, you can fish nymphs, you can fish streamers, you can fish wet flies or soft tackles, where okay, if I want to go fish pike, I can do that. If I want to swing for steelhead, I can do that. If I decide I want to go to the flats for bonefish, or if I want to go tarpon fish, I can, if I have basic skills, I can do any of those things. Then it's just a matter of like, what's the stuff that I enjoy the most? That's the reason that we're out there. We're out there because it makes us feel alive, because it's just so much fun. And so I would tell myself to just focus on the stuff that you really, really enjoy.
All right, Pat, I'll let you try to top that one.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty good answer right there. I don't know. I suppose it's similar. I would just tell myself not to worry too much or as much about what anybody else thought, and do what I enjoyed doing. I certainly had a similar experience of feeling self-conscious, worrying about what other anglers were thinking of me and whether or not I was good enough to be there or what have you. I guess I shouldn't have done that, and I try not to do that today. I mean, sometimes I enjoy, still going out and fishing stuff that I'm not doing a lot, right? Trying to learn new stuff. Lately I'm trying to learn how to fish for carp a little bit more, and I'm not good at it yet, but it's fun to learn. I mean, that's part of what is fun about fly fishing for me in general, is that there's always something new to go out and get better at. I certainly have figured out certain parts of fly fishing that I enjoy a lot. I like you were saying with Todd, I really love to fish dry flies for rising trout. I mean, that's kind of my first choice in most cases, but I try to make sure that I'm not so stuffy that I'm not willing to go out and, I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area, so I don't have a whole lot of that really close by. So I'll go out and fish, big sinking lines and streamers, big bait fish patterns for stripers in the Delta. And I enjoy doing that, or go fish for carp in a local pond or black bass or, whatever there is. So I would just say I wouldn't worry too much about what other people are thinking, and do what you enjoy. Try not to be too judgmental.
Good. John, this next one's for you. You're also from Josh Friedman. If you're approaching...
Hey, Chris. Oh, I want to hear what John would say, because John's going to come from a little bit different perspective than Pat and I are, I suspect. So can you throw that last question at him?
Yeah. What do you tell 15-year-old John Juracek about what other people might think of you when you're on the water?
Oh, I'm much to your surprise, Todd. Maybe I'm going to agree with you and Pat for the most part. What I'm telling myself is figure out what it is about fly fishing that you like. Where do you find the most pleasure in it? Is it fishing a certain way? Is it fishing certain kinds of water? Figure out what that is, and then go ahead and pursue it. And don't worry about what anybody else thinks. And so, one of the things like all the rage, for instance, right now is Euro nymphing. Well, give that a try. If you like it, wonderful. If you don't like it, don't feel as though you've got to do it just because everyone else is doing it. Forget that. Figure out your own path in this sport. What is it you like, and pursue that. And so I think that's probably what I would tell myself as well. You know, just like those guys, figure out what it is I like and pursue that.
I totally agree. And I'll tell you what, if I had discovered carp on a fly rod when I was in my 20s, I might never have fished for trout. But just an aside. Well, I got you, John. Also from Josh Friedemann, if you were to approach a river that you've never fished before and you had zero intel on that river and there were nothing is obviously hatching, how do you go about fishing it?
Well, these days it's almost impossible to have zero intel because there's so many resources available online. But let's just assume that's part of the question. I don't know anything about it. First thing I'm going to get to do at the water is I'm going to take my time and observe. Okay. Are there insects hatching? In which case that can tell me what I might want to fish and how I might want to fish those flies. There's no insects hatching. I'm going to check the bushes. What has been hatching? I'm also going to rely on my bank of knowledge acquired over time of what might be happening that time of year. Okay, so we can always sort of pinpoint, hey, midsummer, you're going to have some insect activity for sure. Late summer, hey, maybe there's nothing going on, but that's terrestrial time. So I think more than anything else, I'm going to take my time and observe. If we do that, most of the time, the river is going to let you know how you should pursue your fishing. You know, what route you should take, what flies you should use. And I think we're always too quick to sort of abandon that. And I can't emphasize how important observation is in taking your time, letting the river let you know exactly what you should do.
Todd, I'd love your answer on that as well. Given that you know where you fish now versus where you fish when you grew up, you faced, not polar opposite fishing conditions, but clearly different. The East Coast, Northeast versus the Rockies, the Northern Rockies. Your thoughts on that question?
Give me the actual question again, Chris.
You're approaching a river that you've never fished before and you have no intel on it at all. When you get there's nothing obviously hatching. How do you go about fishing that river?
I asked myself a really simple question. Is it important to me to catch fish that day? Okay. And that's something, and that might sound sort of goofy, but to me, it's not. There are days I don't care if I catch anything on the water. And, that's one of the benefits of having fished really, really hard for a really, really long time is I've caught a lot of fish. It's not always what I'm after. If, I may say, what, I want to swing streamers today, and that's what I want to do. And if the fish are in the mood, then great. And if they're not, that's okay too. I may say, what, I'm going to put on an attractor dry and I'm going to prospect. I may say, what, I really want to catch fish today, and the odds go way up if I nymph. So maybe I say, okay, I'm going to tie on a couple of nymphs and I'm going to read the stream. I'm going to look at the water in front of me, and I'm going to say, these are the likeliest holding spots for trout in these particular situations. And so I'm going to start pounding those with a couple of nymphs that I think would be effective based on the geology of the river, the general location that we're in, the time of year, all those sorts of things. So, but it all starts with asking myself, I want to be intentional when I fish, right? I want to make conscious choices as opposed to doing things by rote. So I want to say, okay, what am I in the mood to do? And, and if I want to catch fish, I'm going to go into my toolbox and I'm going to pull out what I think is going to do the absolute best job. But I'm not going to assume that's why I'm out there. It may be, okay, I just want to go cast a dry fly. And I may know that cuts my odds way down, but that's what I'm in the mood to do. So, it's one of those things where it sometimes helps to back up and ask ourselves a couple of other questions to sort of put us in the best space to have success for that day, however we choose to measure that success.
Excellent. Pat, I have a question for you. This is from my friend Michael Salamone, who lives in the Vail Valley of Colorado. It's been a long winter, and you've been the
I'm in
Bay.
California. It's still raining?
I was going to say you haven't seen the sun in 6 weeks, probably, maybe longer. We're coming out of winter slumber. Where is the one place or the one stretch of water that you're looking forward to fishing the most?
That's pretty easy because I'm going up to Montana in a couple of weeks to fish the Spring Creeks. So, and I am looking forward to it. I'm looking across my fly tying bench here, and it's been a busy little area for me. So yeah, I've been itching to get out. Actually, I was gonna go out. Last weekend I was kind of looking at reports and looking at river flows, and I couldn't find anywhere to go. I mean, it's just short of a 4 or 5 hour drive right now, there isn't much that's anywhere near me that's fishable right now. So yeah, Spring Creek's in Montana right now.
Nice problem to have for California for a change.
Yeah.
Have a little bit of water going down the hill. John, same question. You and I are in kind of the same general area. I'm a little farther south than you are, but I know you would agree with me. Having I drove up through West Yellowstone a couple weeks ago, and I'm just so tired of it. I can barely stand it. So you tell me, what are you looking most forward to this summer or this season?
Well, I like to start my season. I think of my seasons really beginning on Memorial Day weekend when Yellowstone Park opens, and I always like to be up on the Firehole River that opening weekend. And so while I will start fishing prior to that, places like the Henry's Fork, the Madison, Hebgen Lake, Quake Lake, things like that. Really, I think of the season truly beginning on Memorial Day weekend when the park opens, and I will always be up on the Firehole, regardless of the water conditions, just to be up there and walking the banks of it. And so that's what I really look forward to.
You brought up the lake fishing. One of the questions we have is, what are your how does your general setup change when you go after stillwater fish as opposed to moving water trout?
Well, it depends how I'm going to stillwater fish. And the two ways I do it more than anything else are, one, I sight fish for cruising fish, or I'm fishing to rising fish. Very seldom these days do I find myself sort of blind fishing or fishing sinking lines down deep. So the one thing that I do when I dry fly fish a lake is I am going to make sure I have a double taper fly line, because there are many situations I want to make a long shot without having to strip line in to the head, as I would have to do with a weight forward line, pick up, and then shoot line to the target again. I want to be able to pick line up and set it right back down. On a lake like Hebgen, where we have gulper fishing, time can be of the essence, and there is no time to be stripping in line, false casting, and shooting it out. That's inaccurate and it takes too long. I want to be able to pick up and lay down right away. So that's the one tackle thing I definitely have in still waters. I have a double taper fly line. And also I'm going to make sure I probably have a 9-foot rod, because again, I'm going to be fishing a little bit further than I am in many rivers.
When you fish the gulpers on Hebgen, are you in a boat or are you in a float tube?
These days I mostly wade fish for them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the reason I do that is it's not the best way. A boat or a float tube or any type of floating craft is going to get you more opportunities, but I like the challenge of the casting from shore. You have to be long, you have to be quick, you have to be precise. And so at this point in my angling life, that's kind of what really draws me to that. I want the casting challenge.
Todd, same question for you. I know you don't fish in stillwater, but if you're going to stillwater fish, what's your go-to setup?
That's a good question, Chris. It's been a long time since I've done much stillwater fishing. I used to love to fish ice out on lakes with trout, and I don't know that this is actually a setup so much as it was a technique, but I would love to be out there when the ice was partially on and partially off, and I would literally cast out uh, and have my fly land just on the edge of the ice, and then I would pull it off and drop my tip and then introduce slack, whether I was fishing a leech or a woolly bugger or something along those lines, or even a scud pattern, uh, and let it sink. And a lot of times, fish would take that fly right on the edge of the ice on the sink, or right after I had made my initial one or two strips. But I'm probably not the right guy to ask about the still water stuff. John fishes that all the time down in West, and where we are. Oh, like you had asked John and Pat about about what they were looking forward to fish. Right now, I'm not thinking Stillwater. I'm thinking, Missouri, Henry's Fork, the Livingston Spring Creeks, Paradise Valley Spring Creeks, that kind of stuff. So, maybe Pat has some better Stillwater advice, but I'm afraid that's not my forte, and I should make that clear right up front.
No, that's okay. I mean, that's part of the logic here is to let's ask somebody who doesn't do it much, and just somebody with some fly fishing expertise. It's always good to know. Pat, your thoughts on Stillwater, and then I want to follow up with a fly question for you.
Okay. So as far as Stillwater, I mean, the lakes that I choose to fish more often than not, I'm fishing very much like John was just describing. Even here in California, there's a great lake up in Lassen National Park called Lake Manzanita. Beautiful lake. Mount Lassen is reflected in the surface of it. I mean, you couldn't pick a prettier spot, honestly. And there will be a ton of people out in float tubes and small craft out there dredging leeches, and they can be super effective out there doing it. And I love to just walk the bank and find individual cruising fish or rising fish. Usually in both instances, I can see the fish. So whether I'm casting a dry to them or, casting a tiny nymph out in front of them and stripping it to be intercepted or watch them take it on the drop. So for me, that's what I enjoy doing the most. If that's not happening, I'm not opposed to stripping a leech or a bugger. And if I'm doing that, I'm going to be fishing a full sinking line with a short leader. I mean, that's, I want the fly line to get the fly down to the fish, and then varying retrieves is, usually the thing for me. Varying depths and retrieves, try to figure out where the fish are feeding. And, some of that's going to depend on the lake and the water temperatures and the depths and, fishing along weed beds, things like that.
Sure. Sorry.
Todd has something.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, I wanted to share something just because I think it's relevant, and it's stillwater fishing, but it's something that I don't think many of us focus on or do. I'm a dad. I have a son. He's getting ready to graduate from high school. And over the last 10 or 12 years, maybe even a little longer than that, the vast majority of the stillwater stuff I've done is with him, where we would drive to one of the local stock trout ponds, and he'd take a little 8-foot rod with a floating line and a long leader and fish a little size 16 or 14 soft tackle. And, just going out, and I will tell you, some of the best times I've had fly fishing in the last 10 years have been just watching my son. Maybe his casting wasn't always as good as he would have liked, but to stand on the bank next to a kid and watch him strip in and see a fish follow his fly and then grab it at the last second. There's something really wonderful about that. I think, anybody who listens to us can say, wow, these guys take it pretty damn seriously. And we do, but it doesn't have to be that way. If I was still living on the East Coast, I'd be fishing sunfish or panfish with a fly rod. That sort of thing can be absolutely wonderful. And, we don't always need to be quite so serious about it. So.
Excellent answer. Pat, I wanted to get back to you because of where you live and the waters you fish.
Sure.
This next question, and we're going to do 2 more questions. I'm going to have Pat answer this one, and then I'm going to give one for the group, and then we're going to call it.
Okay.
What's a good fly pattern? And I'm going to make this even more difficult for you. What's a good fly pattern that you use to fish bass, trout, pike, stripers, anything you can possibly think of? And the answer cannot be a clouser minnow.
Because Klaus or minnow came to mind right when you were posing the question. Yeah, so woolly bugger. I mean,
okay.
That's going to be the next, or a deceiver.
Yep, good answer. Good answer. All right, last question, and this is for everybody. We'll start with you since we got you here, Pat. What's the one fish you remember most?
The one fish I remember most. Whew. You know what? It is probably a tarpon that I caught on my honeymoon. And
better than your honeymoon?
About 100-pound tarpon on a 9-weight on my honeymoon, and I broke the rod landing the fish.
That is a memorable fish. Excellent work. John, how about you? What's the one fish you remember the most?
Oh my gosh, that's so hard to pin down. Oh, there's a lot of them. Maybe a fish I caught in Iowa when I was a kid. It was a 3-pound rainbow. Of course, it had been planted at some point in time, but that was beside the fact. It was the largest fish I'd ever caught up to that point in a very, very small stream. And so that's still one of the really important memories I have of my early fly fishing days.
Todd, same question. What's the fish that sticks with you the most?
I'm gonna agree with John, Chris, in that it's hard to say for sure. It can't be a trout because there's too many possibilities there. I would say I flew up to British Columbia once on a steelhead trip, and I had an assignment to write about it. As some of you folks know, I'm an outdoor writer, and I have written a lot about fly fishing over the years. And so I had an assignment to fly up to the Queen Charlotte Islands, actually off the coast of BC. And I think we were there for 7 or 8 days. If you guys hear panting, it's not me, it's my golden retriever. It could be me. But anyway, we were there for approximately a week, and I never touched a fish, and everybody else did. There were 2 or 3 other guys on the trip. I can't remember if Pat was on this one or not, but I never hooked a fish, and I was down to the last hour of the last day, and things were looking a little grim for the story from my perspective, because it's never good when you fly somewhere to fish and don't get a fish at all. And I remember thinking that my typical reaction with an hour left in the last day would be to just fish harder and go absolutely wild. And I consciously took a deep breath and I said, I'm going to go to the bank. I'm going to get a drink of water. I'm going to relax for just a second and then sort of recommit myself to this. And I did that, and I waited back out, and I wasn't in position to really even start casting yet. So I waited out about 20 feet, and I'm fishing a single-hander, which a lot of guys are fishing two-handers. I love to cast single-handers. It's sort of my thing. I'm one of the few guys who still fishes in single-hander for steelhead. And I made a little 30-foot cast, just sort of a line-lengthening cast, and without even really thinking about it, and the line stopped, and I set the hook. And I actually hooked up to a fish, and I was like, damn, is it what kind of fish is it? Because there were trout in that water as well as steelhead. And it swam across the river, and I could not stop it. And I thought, my God, I've actually got the steelhead that I've been looking for. And it started blowing up the pool, and it wasn't a real big river. And a buddy of mine was on the same side of the river as I was, Troy Jones, and he ran down below me and got into a riffle to prevent the fish from swimming back to the ocean. And I try really hard to play fish as quickly as I possibly can. I actually spider webbed that 8-weight. I was fishing a Lewis 8 that day, and it started to crack. But I landed that fish, and he was somewhere, I don't know, somewhere in the 30-pound range, maybe 43 inches, give or take, just a touch. And I remember thinking, what a blessing, and I'm not worthy to hold a fish like this. And I think that's something that we can all, we can all take away from the wonderful fish that we catch, from the wonderful experiences that we have, is that, we're blessed to be out there, right? It's something so many people never have the opportunity to do. They never get to experience, a big rainbow on the Henry's Fork rising up and sucking down their dry fly, or a big Missouri River brown pounding the streamer, or whatever it might be. We are blessed to fly fish. And I think more than any other fish, that steelhead that day brought that realization out, that it was just like, man, I am just so damn fortunate. And, I try and keep that. It's not always easy, but I try and keep that mindset every day. So
that's a great way to wrap it up. A great story. And of course, being an outdoor writer like you, it's always nice to be able to salvage a story with a good story. So congratulations on that. We want to thank everyone for joining us, especially thank you to Todd Tanner, Pat McCabe, and John Juracek. I'm Chris Hunt with Hatch Magazine and Hatch Adventure Travel. We are signing off. Remember, go to hatch.travel/SOT to learn more about the School of Trout classes in August and September. And until next time, we'll catch up with all of you all later. Thanks for joining us.
thanks, Chris.
Thanks.